So let's do a quick survey as we get started this morning. How many of you have ever gotten into trouble for something you said? How many have ever said something, but then later wished you could take it back? You regretted having said it. How many have ever failed to speak up and say something, and later you look back and wish that you had said something or maybe had said it differently from what you did? How many of you have ever been inspired and helped by somebody's words? How many have been hurt by someone's words? Now, I imagine it's probably unanimous or close to it today. Most, if not all of us, have experienced those things. And it points us toward a subject here in the book of James that I warned you a few Sundays ago that we'd eventually get to: our words, the tongue. How we use our tongues or our words. Earlier in the book, it was touched on when it said there in chapter 1, for every man to be swift to hear and slow to speak. But now as we get into chapter 3, it really zeroes in on this idea of what we say and the use of our words. And I'm going to go ahead and do something unusual here and go ahead and give you the main points I believe the Lord wants us to see in this passage as we make sure we aren't deceiving ourselves about our words. So here they are. 1, our words are powerful. Our words are powerful. Then secondly, they can be destructive. They can be destructive. And then third, they reveal what's in our hearts. They reveal what is in our hearts. Well, let's go ahead and read this passage. James chapter 3, verses 1 through 12. My brethren, let not many of you become teachers, knowing that we shall receive a stricter judgment. For we all stumble in many things. If anyone does not stumble in word, he is a perfect man, able also to bridle the whole body. Indeed, we put bits in horses' mouths that they may obey us, and we turn their whole body. Look also at ships. Although they are so large and are driven by fierce winds, they are turned by a very small rudder wherever the pilot desires. Even so, the tongue is a little member and boasts great things. See how great a forest a little fire kindles? And the tongue is a fire, a world of iniquity. The tongue is so set among our members that it defiles the whole body and sets on fire the course of nature, and it is set on fire by hell. For every kind of beast and bird, of reptile and creature of the sea is tamed and has been tamed by mankind. But no man can tame the tongue. It is an unruly evil, full of deadly poison. With it we bless our God and Father, and with it we curse men who have been made in the similitude of God. Out of the same mouth proceed blessing and cursing. My brethren, these things ought not to be so. Does a spring send forth fresh water and bitter from the same opening? Can a fig tree, my brethren, bear olives, or a grapevine bear figs? Thus no spring yields both salt water and fresh. So it begins here by referencing teachers and the desire to be a teacher. Teachers were looked up to and respected. Within the church, those who were teachers of the word were highly regarded. So there were some who aspired to be teachers. It was a prominent and influential role to have within the body of Christ. But James puts out a warning here that with that opportunity of influencing others also comes increased accountability. Those who teach and impact others with their words will be held responsible for what they say or teach. And that's something that preachers and teachers and really all of us, in all our roles as parents, grandparents, friends, all of us who have opportunities to influence others by our words, and we all do to some extent, we all need to keep this in mind. God will hold us accountable for what we do with those opportunities. We will be judged for what we said or taught or what we failed to say and teach. And that leads into this whole subject of one's words and the tongue. And this passage focuses on the tongue, that part of our body we use to verbalize things. Words are important, and words can be powerful. It compares our tongue, or our power of speech, to a couple of things here. It compares it to the small bit that is placed in a horse's mouth. A horse is a large, powerful creature. We don't always realize that until we're standing right next to one. You don't want to mess with a wild horse or a scared horse, or one that is out of control. It can kick you, it can trample you, and severely injure a person or even kill somebody. A typical horse greatly outweighs the typical human being, and yet humans can guide a horse and control it and dictate which direction it goes by using that small bit in its mouth. That bit is small compared to that large horse, but it's influential and powerful, just like our tongues and our words can have power and influence. Similarly, it compares it to the small rudder on a large ship. Now, we've been reminded lately of how important it is to control large ships. We saw how that ship got turned in the Suez Canal and clogged up that important shipping lane for days. And I saw on the news last week about a large cargo ship that had its engine go out, and it was moving uncontrollably out in the ocean in danger of capsizing. They had to rescue the crew and then try to get that large ship tied to some other ship capable of towing it. A large, out-of-control ship can be dangerous, but the small rudder on a ship can cause the whole vessel to turn. The pilot can use that small rudder to guide and turn that whole vessel. It can guide the path of that ship and keep it under control. And this is saying that our words have such power too. The tongue is a relatively small part of our bodies, but it exercises great influence, and it can carry great power. And we need to realize that and be careful with that powerful instrument that is at our disposal. Now, it's kind of like someone who chooses to carry a gun for protection. That person may have every right to carry a gun, but he or she should be very mindful of the power of that weapon they possess. That person needs to be very careful about the use of that gun, even about showing it or pulling it out to threaten somebody with it. Now, I'm afraid there are an increasing number of people in our day who aren't as careful as they ought to be with that power they may be carrying. Rather than having it as a last resort in a life and death situation, they get a little angry at somebody and out pops a gun, then other guns get pulled and you have another shooting incident with people hurt or dead. Now, don't get me wrong. Guns themselves aren't the problem. But one of the problems with people related to guns is when they don't show proper respect for the power of that weapon and the impact it can have on lives and on taking away lives. And we need to have such respect for words and the power of the tongue that we're each carrying with us. I guess in a sense, we're each carrying a concealed weapon in our mouths. It's needed. It's a wonderful ability to possess, but it's powerful, and we need to be careful with it. As James said earlier, we do need to be slow to speak. We need to think before we open our mouths. We ought to consider the consequences of our words and the impact they might have. Just as someone should be slow to pull a gun, we should be slow to open our mouths. There's a power there that we need to respect. And even when we do open our mouths, we should be careful in what we say and in how we say it, keeping that influence in mind. But without a doubt, words can have a great positive influence. The tongue can be a powerful instrument for good. Words can inspire us. They can comfort us. They can encourage us. They can motivate us. They can sound a needed warning. Words can edify us or build us up and help us in our spiritual growth. Words can teach us and guide us. Our tongues can be used for positive purposes. God can use our words for His purposes and to proclaim truth and to manifest love and kindness and encouragement toward others. Our tongues can be a great, powerful force for good, and we need to seek to use it that way. But in this passage, it focuses more on the negative influence of the tongue that we have to be aware of and guard against. The tongue can do a world of good, but as it says here, it can also be a world of iniquity or sin. Our words can build a fire under people to motivate them to get going, or it can be like a warm, cozy fire in a fireplace that comforts people. But our words can also be like a destructive wildfire as pictured here, that spreads and destroys and is hard to control. One little word can spark a huge fire that can destroy relationships and tear down the good things God may be wanting to do. Our words can give life and spread joy, or they can be like poison, as it says here, sucking the life out of people and spreading pain and sorrow and even being deadly. Here are just a few of the ways we use our tongues that the Bible warns us about. Of course, there's blasphemy and using God's name in vain and some of the obvious things concerning cursing and using bad language. But it goes much further than that. Those are some of the things we think of initially, but there are many others too. Bearing false witness, one of the 10 commandments. Bearing false witness against others, accusing others of things they didn't do, slandering others, lying about them, as well as just lying in general. Not being truthful, being deceptive in what we say. Then there's malicious words, saying things that we know will hurt others and cause pain. Using our words as a weapon to harm others, maybe out of vengeance or envy or other bad motives. Using our words to tear people down, maybe thinking that somehow making others look bad makes us look better. And then there's gossip, talking about others behind their backs, spreading rumors or stories about others, or just sharing things, whether they're true or not, that are unnecessary and hurtful to share. Or foolish, coarse talk, crude talk, talk that isn't appropriate for a believer, talk that isn't pure or that promotes impure thoughts. And the Bible even warns us about idle talk, just rattling off about anything and everything. Maybe we aren't using our tongues for bad purposes, but are we using it for the good purposes God intends? Do we use the power of our words just to talk about insignificant things? Or do we use that power to share truth and to show love and to build others up in the faith? And when we consider the impact of our words, we know that it's not just what we say, but how we say it that can have an impact. We can say thank you, but can say it in such a way that it becomes sarcastic and communicates almost the exact opposite of thanks. The way we say things can show our frustration or anger or bitterness. We can say good words, but still use it as a weapon for destruction by how we say it. And that brings us to the next point in this passage, the fact that our words reveal what's in our hearts. Down in verses 9 and 10, it talks about how someone might use their words to bless God one minute, then turn around the next minute and use their words to curse men. Blessing and cursing coming out of the same mouth. It declares here, "My brethren, these things ought not to be so." And the people around us know that. The unbelievers we encounter pick up on those inconsistencies very quickly, don't they? And it often gives them ammunition to use to blast Christians or to call them hypocrites or to justify their own lack of faith. Now we're talking about people who will sit in a church service like this, people who will lift up their voices in praise to God, people who will sing the songs of worship, pray the prayer, share a testimony, but then who go out into the world and let their tongues run off in some of these other directions we've been talking about. Cursing, gossiping, slandering, crude speech, lying, and so on. Now granted, we all struggle with the use of our words at times in one way or another. I mean, James admits that here. He talks about how difficult it is to control the tongue, and that the person who is able to tame his tongue has reached an admirable level of maturity. We're all going to be tempted, and at times we'll probably stumble when it comes to the use of our words. But we're not talking about occasional stumbles at this point. We're talking more about a regular inconsistency, when we're regularly blessing God one minute and then abusing the power of our words the next. When we praise God in church and regularly use our words to tear down others outside of church. When we speak kindly and lovingly on Sunday mornings, but then speak harshly and maliciously, maybe even before we get back home. There's something wrong if blessing and cursing, edifying words and hurtful words, kind words and malicious words are constantly coming out of the same mouth. And that gets to the point that our words reveal what's in our hearts. If bad things are coming out of our mouths, it says something about our hearts and a change that needs to take place there. It goes on here in verses 11 and 12 to point out that a spring doesn't send forth both fresh water and bitter water, and a fig tree doesn't bear olives, neither does a grapevine bear figs. What's it saying here? The fruit of our lips, what comes out of our mouths, reveals what kind of tree we really are. The fruit of our lips reveals what kind of tree we really are. It reveals what we really are in our hearts and in our minds. So even though some good words might come out at times, the bad words or the harsh words or the lies or the gossip or whatever it may be suggests that there's something not right on the inside that needs attention and needs the transforming work of the Holy Spirit. And again, we're not talking about occasional stumbling. We're talking about what consistently comes out of our mouths, at least on a fairly regular basis. Is it fresh, life-giving water, or is it bitter water that poisons others and poisons the atmosphere around it? I mean, Jesus basically said the same thing. He said that those things which proceed out of the mouth come from the heart, and they defile a man. We need to pay attention to what comes out of our mouths. And if what we hear ourselves saying isn't good, we need to do more than just work on controlling our tongues. We need to seek God's help in dealing with whatever attitude or spirit or way of thinking is going on in our hearts and minds. It's not just the surface water which needs attention. It's the spring from which that water is flowing. And that's another way that we can deceive ourselves about our words. That we may know we have a problem, but we just focus on what we say and trying to control it rather than going deeper and trying to deal with where those words are coming from, the attitude and the spirit behind them. Let's ask the Lord not just to help us clean up our language or control our tongues, but let's ask Him to search our hearts and change anything there that needs working on. Maybe you remember the episode of the old Andy Griffith Show when Andy's girlfriend at the time, Ellie Walker, decided to run for city council. When she first brought up the idea of a woman running for that office, Andy described it as silly because in Mayberry at that time only men had run for those elected offices. Well, Ellie got upset at Andy for calling it silly, so he tried to take it back, even acting like he pulled it back out of her ear and put it back in his mouth, and he said it had a bad taste to it. And so they kind of made light of it there and laughed it off there for a moment. You know, and sometimes we wish we could do that, don't we? We take back something that we let slip out. Then a few minutes later, Andy used the same word again, describing Ellie's suggestion as silly. And that time she really got mad and marched off in anger because it was obvious that it wasn't just a slip of the tongue, but it revealed what Andy really thought about the subject. And that's what we need to be aware of too. We're all going to have slips of the tongue occasionally. But when we're all too often finding ourselves saying things we shouldn't, or in some way misusing the power of our words as we talked about here this morning, maybe it's more than a slip of the tongue. Maybe there's something going on inside our hearts that needs attention. If so, let's not ignore it. Let's seek the Lord's help to get our hearts in line and then, as a result, get our tongues under control. Because we will be held accountable by the Lord for how we use this powerful ability of speech God has given us. Let's guard against the bad ways we can use it, and let's use it in good and positive ways.